Mike, when you first reported that Donald Trump wanted to use the Justice Department to prosecute his perceived political enemies, people like Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey, it was a big scoop. It is now essentially the policy of the Barr Justice Department. I mean, how much of this is just out in the open, Donald Trump wanting to punish someone that he probably views as being disloyal and Barr going along with it? Because that, from the outside, seems to be how Barr rolls.
Well, it's sort of remarkable, and I write about this in the book, about these memos that were written in April of 2018, sort of early on in the administration by the White House counsel, Don McGahn, that basically told the president that if you even appear to be meddling in the Justice Department's work, then you could face immense consequences. You could be voted out of office. You could be impeached. People at the Justice Department could resign. You're never going to be successful if you try and do this. And the funny thing is that despite being told this, the president continued to try and meddle in the Justice Department work, especially even just talking about it. And that's the thing that I think people lose sight of, is that by the president and the attorney general in different instances talking about investigations, they create the perception of an impropriety. It creates the perception that the most powerful person in the executive branch is putting pressure on the Justice Department to do the things that he wants done politically for him. So even if a case is made based on the merits, there are questions about it because the president has weighed in. There's a reason why previous presidents were counseled against weighing in about investigations, because it taints the perception of them.
You know, Rick Stengel, I interviewed John Bolton when his book came out, and I specifically asked him if he had concerns about Bill Barr. His answer was no, but I think that meant he probably did and was trying to publicly curry some sort of, I don't know, favorable public rapport with him. But Bill Barr is implicated in John Bolton's book as one of the people, you know, when you're the national security advisor and you pull the fire alarm, there are not many people that are going to come. But one of them, it would appear Bolton thought, might have been the attorney general, who he called when he had concerns that the president's foreign policy had been corrupted by either personal business alliances or other personal interests with Turkey and China. I mean, should Bill Barr have anything to do with the criminal prosecution of John Bolton?
No, he has a conflict of interest, and I'm sure Bolton didn't imagine that this would be the kind of end game. Let me just say, I had reservations about Bolton doing the book and not testifying about impeachment for the House impeachment inquiry. That was not a profile in courage, and I have a problem with that. But I went back. I knew we were going to be talking about this today, and I went back and looked at the guidelines, because I had to follow the same guidelines for my book, which came out after I left the Obama administration, and they are guidelines. They are not rules or laws. It's a subjective choice. They say that it's voluntary for you to submit your book or your manuscript to your agency, whether it's the National Security Agency or the State Department. I remember when I submitted mine, I just submitted those parts that I thought might be a problem. They get back to you with suggestions. I think it's very, very clear here, and Mike was alluding to this, is that the Trump administration was using this as a way of delaying or perhaps ending the publication of Bolton's book. The NSC had approved it. Then the White House went back for review. I think one of the things that Bolton's lawyer will say in court is that this was far from a good faith effort on the part of the administration to look for classified material. And finally, by the way, I would really trust John Bolton more than some, either Justice Department official or some low-level White House official to know what is a national security matter rather than what they think it is.
So, Rick, on this question of classification, I mean, to help people understand this, I read the book. I mean, and here's what Donald Trump said. I told the AG before I would consider every conversation with me as president highly classified. That is not the standard for classification. Now, we know when he's extorting the president of Ukraine, that conversation isn't just classified. It's put into a server saved for literally operational intel. I mean, they have a very loose and subjective relationship with classification. Can you talk about that factor?
Yes. So in the role that Bill Barr is playing, which is the Roy Cohn role for Donald Trump, Bill Barr believes that executive privilege protects every single thing the president does, every interaction that the president has with somebody else. And by the way, Donald Trump agrees with that. But in this case, what Trump thinks is classified is information about me, which shows that I am lawless and not following norms. That's what he thinks is classified. Again, I read Bolton's book, which I found incredibly damning, in part because it's first-person eyewitness of the chaos and lunacy and ignorance that Donald Trump displays day in and day out. Well, that is exactly what Donald Trump thinks is classified material. First-hand observations of his own ignorance and betrayal of the American people.
Mike Schmidt, last question. They've convened a grand jury. Does that mean they're taking evidence and trying to indict John Bolton? What does that mean?
Well, they've served a subpoena, and usually the only reason you serve a subpoena is to get evidence to determine whether a crime was committed. So they've opened up an investigation here. They obviously believe they've cleared the threshold to determine whether a crime was committed and want to get as much evidence as possible to figure out if there's a violation of the law. It's a pretty straightforward thing. This is not too dissimilar from previous cases in which we've seen government officials that have been investigated for how they handle classified information. It appears like that is the approach that the Justice Department is taking here. Now, what you could see, and you'll probably likely see, is that the Bolton side and the publisher side of this are going to fight these subpoenas and will go to court to quash the subpoenas, and there will be an extended legal argument about that'll play out probably for many, many months.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.